In the last chapter, our main focus was elements, manipulating them, but really we were manipulating their exterior. If it was their border, if it was their outline, if it was their transparency, if they're visible or not visible as a whole. In this chapter, we dive deeper into the element itself and start controlling its properties. We're going to start off with looking at the width and height and how to create a width and height that is dynamic so we can create dynamic layouts. By the end of this lesson, you will have the core tools to create elements that will resize and shape and change based on whatever the screen resolution that the user has at any given time. Let's jump right into it and learn it and do it in action. For the sake of this chapter, we split out a new little example that is really based off of our last sample. So just go ahead into your samples and just move into, and let me just push out the videos, move into site number 2. All right. Now, in site number 2, you're going to find a few things. One is you're going to find your index file, where in our index file, we have our just an article with a headline and a couple of paragraphs that are inside of that article. Without further ado, let's jump right in. And what I want to do is I want to basically control the width and height of things in general. For example, if I wanted to configure the width and height of my footer and not have it be the default as it is right now, let's go ahead and change that. And it's really simple. We've seen it in action previously, more or less. At least we've seen parts of that logic. And I'm going to go ahead here and just break lines here. So we have a width. This is simple enough. I could set it to be 100 pixels, and I could go ahead to my height and set it to be 100 pixels as well. And maybe in a more realistic scenario, we might want to change it to be something else, but I'm going to go ahead and save it. I'm going to refresh, and now we have our footer. Now I could, if I'm not happy with this width, which I kind of am, maybe I'm not happy with the height, which is probably too many pixels. Maybe I'll change the height to 40 pixels. But really in a real world scenario, a lot of times if you're doing and creating your design dynamically, you might go ahead to that element, inspect that element, and then just go into that height and play around with the value until you're happy with the actual value. So let's say I'm happy with 20 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead there and just configure it to be 20 pixels, and that's it. And then I created my element. I'm happy with it. I have a width. I have a height. So far, so good. Now, let's take another look. And something very common is text, if it doesn't have anything that's bounding it, will just go wild. And it's really hard to read copy that is laid out so widely. It's just not natural for our eye. In general, people tend to prefer reading things that have up to 10 words per line. So in this case, I have your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Really, this is where ideally I would cut off. I would not want all this extra stuff. So let's say I would cut it off maybe in this range, in this area, or really and I'm just going to take a measurement tool of my Apple here. So we're really talking about around that 460 pixels. For my case, and my font size would be a good size, a good legible size. Now, to do that, all I will really have to do is I'm going to go ahead and add another rule beyond my article rule. I want to add, and I'm just going to get rid of that semicolon because there's nothing after it. I'll do that also on this one because we're saving a little space. Anything inside of the article, every paragraph inside of the article, what do we want to do there? We want to limit their width to be 500 or 450 pixels. That's all I had to do. I'm not going to also change the height because text is fluid. It changes in size, so I probably would never control its height in that capacity. But if I go ahead there and I click on refresh, we'll see that now our copy is going to be sitting nicely and flushedly in a way that is a lot more legible than it was before. Now, there's a few more problems when it comes down to width and height. And that comes down to the fact that if I just go ahead here and I just get rid of this width by just commenting it out, one of the problems that I'm going to have here is not really a problem, but one of the things in the natural layout is if I go ahead and I resize, notice how the copy is resizing dynamically, which is wonderful and something that many times I would want that to happen. Because if the user is resizing, I want the content to resize with them. Talking about the future of the web is designs that are not specific to a specific resolution, but designs that are built for the user, built based on whatever their resolution is. For me to be able to adhere to this, if I would go ahead and just uncomment that width again, notice what would happen by defining absolute pathing, by saying, hey, you're 450 pixels. If I resize my element smaller than the size of the text, my text is not resizing, forcing my user to need to scroll to be able to read the content. So that's definitely not something good. A way to solve this, and there's a couple of things that we could do, is to define, instead of a width that is absolute, to define basically a minimum width or a maximum width. And in this case, I want to set a maximum width to my element, saying, hey, your content will be, the max size you will have will be 450 pixels. Now, in this case, if I set it to be a maximum width and I go ahead and I try to resize my element, when I resize my element and it reaches a position where the text is will be out of bounds, the text starts resizing. Now, again, under the same kind of concept, what if a copy this size is just not legible because it's just too small, but really this is the smallest we want our copy to get? In that case, I could go ahead and just literally just figure out what is that width. In this case, it's about 400 or 370. And if it's 370 pixels, I could go ahead and say, hey, by the way, not only do I want to limit the width of my item based on its maximum size, I could also set a minimum width to my item, setting that minimum width to be 360 pixels, making sure that if I go ahead here and I click on refresh, that when I start resizing, my copy will resize. But once I reach the limit of resize, the copy will not continue and resize. So I could that way create a gap, a range of acceptable values instead of defining an absolute value. Now, by default, the value of my width is going to be 100% of the space that I'm in. So literally, the default value right here is 100%. I could have, if I wanted, defined it also relatively now, set it to be 90% if I wanted to. By setting it to 90%, I'm still adhering to the rules of max width and max and min width. Remember that as long as I'm defining my width in a relative, and aka in percentages, then it's going to continue working. So if I go ahead here and click on refresh, we'll see that now our copy by default is defined with a maximum because it's now in a position that is 450 pixels are a lot less than 90%. So we were basically making sure that the 90% would never happen in the screen resolution. But as our screen becomes smaller, we're going to see that we have a gap here that is being created based on that rule that we applied to that 90%. So notice in this game of combination things, but if you put inside a width that is absolute, then obviously it breaks down a lot of the logic here, and then something is going to override something. So you could play with the width, max width, min width, and max width. And on top of that, you could also play, just by the way, I'm going to put here as a reference. We're not going to get into it because it's the exact same thing. The same rules apply when it comes down to height. So you have yourself your height, you have yourself your max height, min height. So you have your min height. Let me just put that right there. Min height, max height, and obviously height. So there you go. So that is the basics of defining and shaping the size of shapes in CSS.